You're too poor to matter in this family, Raymond. I hope you understand that eventually. That was the sentence that changed everything. Not shouted, not delivered in anger, just my daughter-in-law's voice, calm and matter-of-fact, at her own father's 60th birthday party, explaining to me exactly where I ranked in a family I'd been quietly, patiently trying to belong to for 6 years. 20 minutes later, her father, a man I'd exchanged maybe a dozen words with in 6 years of family gatherings, stopped mid-conversation across the room, stared at an old faded patch stitched onto the collar of my jacket, and crossed that entire party without saying a word to anyone else, until he was standing directly in front of me, his hand already extended, his voice shaking slightly as he asked, "3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry. Is that patch real? Were you actually there? Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway." If you've ever been told, plainly, that your worth was measured in dollars rather than in what you'd actually lived through, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened at that party. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 34 years working for the Postal Service, unglamorous, steady work that let me raise my son Michael in a modest 2-bedroom house I still live in today, 41 years after my wife Doris and I bought it together, a small mortgage we paid off slowly and carefully over 2 decades of careful budgeting. Doris passed 5 years ago, and since then I've lived alone, keeping myself busy with a small garden, a standing Thursday breakfast with 2 old friends, and the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who spent decades doing physically demanding work and has genuinely earned a quieter chapter. Here's the thing about me that almost nobody in Michael's wife's family fully understands, even though the evidence of it exists in a small wooden box in my closet, alongside a modest collection of medals I've discussed with almost nobody outside a small circle of men who served alongside me decades ago. Before the Postal Service, before Doris, before I became simply Michael's dad works at the post office, to the wealthy family my son had married into, I served 2 years in the Army, including 13 months in Vietnam, attached to a battalion that saw some of the most difficult combat operations of that entire era, an experience that shaped, more profoundly than anything else in my life, the particular quiet, unhurried way I've carried myself ever since. Michael married a woman named Brianna about 6 years ago, the daughter of a genuinely wealthy businessman named Gerald Ashcroft, whose family runs in circles considerably more affluent than the modest working-class world I raised Michael in. From the very first family gathering, I sensed, correctly as it turned out, that Brianna had already formed a fairly complete assessment of me based on my modest house, my old car, and the plain, unremarkable way I dress and carry myself, an assessment that had, over 6 years, calcified into something considerably harder than simple social awkwardness. I want to be careful here, because I don't think Brianna is a fundamentally cruel person. But over 6 years of marriage to Michael, I noticed a specific pattern developing in how she treated me at family gatherings. A pattern rooted, I've come to understand, in a particular anxiety about how a working-class father-in-law might reflect on her family's carefully cultivated social standing. There was a family dinner, about 4 years ago, when Gerald mentioned, in passing, that he'd grown up with genuine financial struggle himself before building his eventual success, and Brianna interjected quickly, changing the subject, later explaining to me privately that Dad likes to tell that story, but it's not really something we need to dwell on in front of guests. A comment that struck me, even then, as a strange thing to say about her own father's history, though I didn't yet understand how it connected to her broader anxieties. There was a holiday gathering the following year when Brianna's mother asked, with polite curiosity, what I'd done for a career, and Brianna answered for me, quickly. Dad-in-law worked for the Postal Service, very steady, very reliable. A description accurate as far as it went, but delivered with a specific brevity that closed the subject before anyone had reason to ask a follow-up question. There was an afternoon, about a year ago, when I overheard Brianna on the phone with a friend, through the thin walls of Michael's house during a visit, describing me as sweet, but honestly kind of embarrassing in front of my parents' friends. This whole working class thing doesn't exactly fit the image, if you know what I mean. I stood in that hallway for a good 10 seconds, listening to my own daughter-in-law describe 34 years of honest work and, though she didn't know it, 13 months of combat service as an image problem. And then I continued toward the kitchen, saying nothing about what I'd heard. She never knew I'd heard a word. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Brianna in the way people are angry at strangers. Brianna had built her own identity around her family's carefully cultivated social standing, and I think, understandably enough, she'd absorbed a particular anxiety about anything that might complicate that standing, without ever actually asking real questions about who I was. Underneath the surface details she'd already decided defined me completely. The specific comment that set everything in motion happened at Gerald Ashcroft's 60th birthday party, a lavish event held at a country club, attended by dozens of Gerald's business associates and old friends. I arrived in my one good jacket, an older piece I'd owned for years, genuinely wanting to celebrate my son's father-in-law's milestone properly. About an hour into the party, standing near a quiet corner away from the main crowd, Brianna approached me, her expression carrying a particular tightness I'd learned, over 6 years, to recognize as precursor to something uncomfortable. "Raymond," she said, "I need you to understand something, and I hope you won't take this the wrong way. My father's business associates are here tonight, important people, people whose opinion genuinely matters for Dad's company, and, honestly, for Michael's own career prospects going forward. I need you to just keep a low profile tonight, not because I don't care about you, but because, honestly, you're too poor to matter in this family's world, and I need you to understand that eventually, so we can stop pretending otherwise at every single event." I want to be honest about what that specific phrase, "too poor to matter," did to me, standing in that quiet corner in my one good jacket, having genuinely tried, for 6 years, to represent my son well among a family that had never once asked a real question about who I actually was before deciding, apparently, exactly how much I mattered. I didn't argue with her. I nodded, said I understood, and retreated further into the quiet corner she'd effectively assigned me to, carrying a particular kind of hurt I didn't fully examine until later that evening. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever been told, plainly, by someone in your own family, that your worth had already been calculated and found lacking, based on nothing but a bank account they'd never actually asked about? How did you carry that assessment, knowing there might be an entire history underneath it that nobody had bothered to investigate? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 20 minutes later is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it began without me saying a single word to start it. Gerald Ashcroft, making his way through his own party, greeting guests and business associates, happened to pass near my quiet corner, his eyes catching, almost by accident, on a small, faded patch stitched onto the collar of my jacket, a detail so worn and unremarkable that most people never noticed it at all. I watched his expression shift, in the space of a few seconds, from polite social autopilot to something else entirely, a kind of stunned, searching recognition that made him stop mid-conversation with someone else entirely and begin crossing the room with clear, urgent purpose. "Excuse me," he said, arriving in front of me with an intensity that drew the attention of several nearby guests. "That patch, 3rd Battalion, 21st Infantry. Is that real? Were you actually there?" "I was," I said, and I want to note that I said it quietly, without any particular performance in it at all, the same tone I might have used to mention the weather. Gerald's hand was already extended, and when I shook it, I felt it trembling slightly, an emotion I hadn't expected from a man I'd only ever known as a distant, successful businessman. My older brother served with that battalion, Gerald said, his voice carrying a specific weight now. Vietnam, 1971. He never came home. I was 12 years old when the notification came. I've spent 40 years trying to learn anything real about what that battalion actually went through over there, and I've never once, in all these years, met someone who could confirm they were actually with that unit, at that specific time. I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet for over 4 decades opened its eyes, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of tired, unexpected recognition, the specific stillness of a man understanding that a stranger's private grief and his own private history had just, without warning, collided directly. "What was your brother's name?" I asked. "David Ashcroft," Gerald said. "Corporal David Ashcroft." I felt something settle in my chest, a specific, heavy recognition I hadn't expected to feel at a country club party. "I knew David," I said. "Not well. We were in different companies within the battalion, but I knew him. Quiet young man, always had a photograph of his family in his helmet liner. I remember him specifically because he used to talk about wanting to open a hardware store someday, back home." Gerald's composed businessman's face broke entirely in that moment, tears forming that he didn't bother trying to hide, standing in the middle of his own 60th birthday party. "Nobody has ever told me anything real about him from over there," he said. 40 years, and I've never once heard someone actually describe a real memory of my brother as a person, rather than just a name on a memorial." Brianna, standing several feet away, had gone very still, her expression moving through several rapid transformations, confusion at her father's sudden emotional display, then a dawning, disbelieving recognition as she began to understand what was actually happening in front of her. "Dad," she said, "what's going on? Do you actually know Raymond?" "Brianna," Gerald said, his voice still unsteady. "This man served in the exact same battalion as Uncle David. He actually knew him, actually remembers him as a real person. Do you understand what that means? 40 years, and I've just met the first person who can tell me my brother existed as more than a folded flag and a name on a wall." I want to describe what happened over the following portion of that party, because it's the actual heart of this story, more than the too poor to matter comment, or the coincidence of the patch itself. Gerald pulled me away from that quiet corner Brianna had assigned me to, sitting with me at a private table for nearly an hour, while the party continued around us, asking question after question about his brother, about the specific circumstances of that deployment, about details he'd spent 4 decades desperately wanting someone to confirm. "Dad told me you were too poor to matter," Brianna said, that phrase apparently reaching Gerald's second hand at some point during that conversation, her voice carrying genuine distress now as the full weight of what she'd said earlier in the evening began settling into place. "I heard that," I said quietly, not with any particular anger, simply stating the fact. Gerald turned to his daughter, his expression carrying an intensity I don't think she'd seen from him before. "Brianna, this man served this country in circumstances I can barely imagine, at an age younger than you are right now. He knew your uncle, personally, as an actual human being, rather than a name I've grieved for 40 years without ever fully understanding who he actually was. And you told him he was too poor to matter, at my own birthday party, standing exactly 20 feet from where I've been talking to old business associates about quarterly earnings." Brianna didn't have an immediate response to that. I watched her face carry a specific, uncomfortable recognition, the particular discomfort of someone realizing the ground beneath a carelessly delivered dismissal had turned out to be considerably less stable than she'd assumed. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where that party conversation is the climax and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Brianna calling me directly, about a week later, asking if she could come by alone, sitting at my kitchen table with genuine discomfort on her face. "I need to actually apologize properly," she said that afternoon. "Not the version where I explain away what I said. I told you that you were too poor to matter, in front of my father's business associates, at his own birthday party. And it turns out you knew my uncle, personally, in circumstances that clearly cost you something profound to live through. I built an entire assessment of your worth around your bank account, and I never once thought to ask what might actually be underneath that assessment. That's an honest thing to say, I told her. I'd rather have that than a comfortable excuse. Can I ask you something? She said. That night, at that battalion, what was it actually like? Not the version for a stranger, the real version, if you're willing to share it with me. I want to be honest that this question, coming from Brianna specifically, after 6 years of careful, managed distance between us, caught me somewhat off guard. I spent the next several hours telling her, in more detail than I'd shared with almost anyone outside my closest circle of fellow veterans, what those 13 months had actually involved, the specific weight of losing men I'd served alongside, the particular way that experience had shaped the quiet, unhurried man I'd become in the decades since. I think I built my entire understanding of you around the most convenient assumption, she said, near the end of that conversation. A retired postal worker, modest house, old car, nothing particularly noteworthy underneath the surface. I never considered that the surface might be covering something considerably more significant than anything in my own carefully curated social circle. Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. Gerald, in the weeks following that party, invited me to several subsequent gatherings, not as a peripheral family member to be managed, but as an honored guest, introducing me, unprompted, to his business associates as the man who actually knew my brother, who served in circumstances most of us can barely imagine. I watched Brianna, in the months after that, do something I hadn't fully seen her do before. At a subsequent family gathering, when one of her mother's friends made an offhand comment about my modest circumstances, Brianna said, without hesitation, Raymond served 13 months in combat in Vietnam, in the exact battalion my uncle died serving in. He personally remembers Uncle David as an actual person, something nobody in this family has ever been able to say. I once told him he was too poor to matter, and it's genuinely one of the things I regret most from the past 6 years. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a story you'd carried quietly, mostly alone, for over 4 decades. I thought about Doris a great deal in those weeks, wondering what she would have made of watching Brianna finally reckon with an assumption she'd carried, largely unexamined, right up until an old, faded patch on a jacket collar forced the reckoning into the open at her own father's birthday party. It's been almost a year now since that party. Brianna calls regularly now, genuine conversations, rather than the careful, managed politeness that characterized much of our relationship in the 6 years before that evening. She's stopped, entirely, the specific habit of managing how I might be perceived among her family's social circle, and I've noticed her, on more than one occasion, actively correcting others who make similar assumptions about my modest circumstances. Gerald and I have lunch every few months now, an unlikely friendship built on a shared 40-year-old grief he'd never had anyone to properly share with until that party. He's asked, more than once, if I'd be willing to help him understand more of his brother's service history, work that has given both of us a genuinely meaningful connection neither of us expected to find at a 60th birthday party. I think about that quiet corner often now, sitting in my garden some evenings, genuinely content with a modest life very few people who meet me casually would ever guess carries the specific weight it does. How much of the people we dismiss we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding anything deliberately, but because we've already decided, based on a bank account or a modest house, exactly what shape someone's worth is allowed to take. Brianna looked at me for 6 years and saw a working-class father-in-law who complicated her family's social standing. She wasn't entirely wrong that I live modestly. She was wrong about nearly everything else. I don't regret the years of quietly carrying my military history without insisting Brianna fully understand its actual weight. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let the too poor to matter comment stand, even briefly, without correcting it myself in that quiet corner. I've never been in the habit of announcing my service to justify my presence in a room, and I don't think that habit needed to change simply because someone assumed, incorrectly, that a bank account was the only relevant measure of worth. What I've learned, watching Brianna genuinely reckon with the gap between her assumption and the actual reality, is that sometimes the people we love need direct, undeniable evidence, arriving through circumstances neither of us could have planned, before an abstract truth about someone's actual worth finally has room to land, rather than a father-in-law insisting on his own value in an already uncomfortable corner of a party. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone measured your worth by your bank account, rather than what you'd actually lived through, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe every quiet, modest person deserves to be seen for who they actually are, not just what they appear to have. Hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.